Terrorism in our era is an illegitimate method of war, and just as illegitimate methods of war have been identified and universally determined to be eliminated, there is a need to do the same with terrorism. There was a time when chemical weapons and biological weapons were outlawed. What is the problem in dealing with the issue of terrorism? The same way the problem lies in this endless debate about defining terrorism. And it is ironic that several states that after 9/11 signed on as allies with the United States and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as allies in the war against terrorism still dispute and debate the definition of terrorism, which makes one ask, then what are you allies against if you do not know the definition of what a terrorist is? Soon after 9/11, President George Bush had addressed the United Nations, and there he said that we are asking for a comprehensive commitment to this fight. We must unite in opposing all terrorists, not just some of them. And he had said that in this world there are some good causes and bad causes, and we can disagree over what a good cause or a bad cause is. But there is no such thing as a good terrorist. It's been 16 years since the war on terrorism was declared. What we see is that there has been an erosion of the commitment of the global leaders towards the idea of a universal war against the very concept of terrorism. It seems that terrorists in certain parts of the world, when they act in certain parts of the world, they bear the brunt of international pressure, and the whole world is told to deal with them. And yet, in other parts, the victims do not get justice with the same speed. Just to give you an example, I don't know how many people in this audience remember the Lockerbie attacks of 1988. It took many years, but the global intelligence networks identified who were the individuals in Libya who planned these attacks. Those people were identified, demands were made. Libya denied that these people had anything to do with it. Libya was sanctioned, and at the end of the day, a trial was held in the Netherlands under Scottish law, and those individuals were convicted more than 11 years after the terrorist attack. On the other hand, there were terrorist attacks in Mumbai in 1993. There was an attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001, and then there was the Mumbai attacks of 2008. And in none of those cases has that process of international cooperation, identification of the people who did it, and then a global effort to try and put them on trial has been effected. What we can deduce from that is that in the 1970s and 80s, when the concept of state sponsorship or support for terrorism first came, the states that were initially identified were relatively small-sized states. So the first designation that the United States made in 1979 of state sponsors of terrorism, the countries that were designated were Libya, South Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. And they were all from the Middle East. None of them had extensive economic, political, or military relations with the US or the Western European nations. They were also all considered to be closer to the Soviet Union than they were to the Western Bloc. So because of Cold War politics also, it wasn't important to think of their perspective or their point of view, and it was easy to make the designation. After 79, a few more countries were added to the list. The countries that were added were North Korea, Iran, if I'm not mistaken, Cuba, and Sudan. Again, you will notice small-sized states, all not falling in the parameters of being Western allies. Now, in the last few years, The countries that have been identified as supporting terrorists or hosting terrorists, responsible for certain large terrorist incidents, are all much larger. Some of them have a historic pattern of being allies of the Western nations. And so that has made the process of designating anybody who engages in terrorism but is an ally, designating them as terrorists becomes far more complicated and difficult. My point would be that if the world is to get rid of terrorism as a method of an illegitimate method of war, then these exceptions would have to be brought to an end. If and as long as these exceptions are maintained, exceptions for strategic reasons, exceptions for economic reasons, exceptions for political reasons, we will not be able to have the universal front against terrorism that President Bush promised right after 9/11. The world stood by the United States when the terrorist attack took place, but other countries that have been victims of terrorism have not necessarily had the same kind of universal support. Second thing I would say is that there was a time when terrorism was identified with non-state actors. So when the IRA was the major source of terrorism for the British knew that they were trying to identify individuals who had ganged up or got together to become terrorists. They were not people who were being trained. So, for example, it wasn't that the IRA was a French-sponsored attempt to try and settle some historic score with the English or the British. On the other hand, we find that an increasing number of terrorist entities have state sponsorship and support, operate openly, and states actually make the argument that they are not terrorists. And then there are other much more powerful states that block designation of these entities by the United Nations for their terrorist activities simply because of their international relations considerations. I would suggest that if we are to have a better 21st century in terms of dealing with the terrorist menace, then this exceptionalism and this attempt to try and subject terrorist designation to political considerations and strategic considerations has to be brought to an end.